Hello and welcome to a special edition of This is Sofaville. My name's Ron Moder and I'm the writer and creator and producer and so many other things of the podcast. I thought to spend a small amount of time this week just going over why I created the podcast in the first place, and then giving you an insight into the first 5 episodes of This is Sofaville, namely episode 1, which was Follow the Band, episode 2, Marjorie's Waiting, episode 3, Wesley's Dog, episode 4, Once Upon a Time in St. Petersburg, and episode 5, Dave the Almighty. All of them were created for different reasons, some based on true events, real people, and some just purely fiction, to be honest, based on ideas that I had or experiences I'd gone through or stories told to me by other people. So we'll start with why the podcast was created in the first place. I created This is Sofaville because initially I'd come up with an idea for a series of stories that were essentially sketches that took place on sofas. I was going to have a number of people just sitting on a sofa and imagine what kind of conversations people could have. They were generally comedy sketches and a few of them turned out okay. None of them have so far made it to the podcast, but let's see how that goes in the future. And that's why it was called This is Sofaville, because the entire world was going to revolve around this one particular sofa. Eventually it transformed into a platform for actors, really, to showcase their vocal skills and also to help actors out the best that I could at a difficult time. We were at the end of the pandemic. Lots of people were struggling to find work, not necessarily the people who ended up recording for the podcast, but these were people that were happy to give their time just to help out with a new project, and in the process of doing so, they got updated credits on their CVs, and it got them back into the acting world. Some people had been acting more often than others. What you'll find in the acting world is that generally people are very generous with their time, very happy to network, and very happy to help each other out. So that being the case, when I first put a shout out to ask if anybody wanted to help on the podcast, people came through quite willingly, even though the original idea did you want to get involved in a project and see where it goes from there? And hands started being raised metaphorically across the internet and people just stepped up. There was no audition process. I deliberately came up with the idea that it should be first come, first serve. I wanted people to represent themselves as much as my work, so the work was generally not written for them. It was a case of, here is the script, you are the person who has stepped forward, irrelevant of how in a traditional casting session you might be for this script, you're actually going to be the one who reads it now, so you either adjust to it or you make it your own and you make it the way that you would present it, the way that you think represents your vocal skills. And that being the case, we have a mixture of results. Some people sound like they were this character all along, whereas others have put a unique take on it, and it just gives you a different way of viewing the material, and I'm equally happy with every single way that it turned out. Let's have a look at the episodes that we had. So number 1 was actually Follow the Band with Ian Donnelly, a Liverpool-based actor. He was our first person to record for us. Follow the Band was about a mock interview in a pub with a guy that's clearly been into a new wave / punk band since the early 80s. This was inspired by actually members of my family who've been following a punk band, a well-known punk band, for many, many years. And it was about stories that they told me about the private lives that people had. Every single time that this particular band would gather together, they would go on tour perhaps once a year, generally around the same time of year. And these people, whatever their background, would gather together at various venues across the country, Cambridge, Brighton, all across the UK. And some of these people were rich and some people were not. Some people had a lot of time to themselves, some people had families, some were retired. But either way, the one binding connection was this particular band. And I started imagining how that could become all-encompassing. If you've got problems in your life, if you've got distractions in your marriage, then suddenly you might redirect that, and that means that this band becomes all-important to you. It's the same as the psychology behind redirecting anger, redirecting love. When you get angry at things, a lot of the time the anger is not about the current problem that you're experiencing. A lot of the time it's because you've been sitting on anger for a very long time, and then suddenly it all comes out just because somebody happens to tap that vein. And it was the same with the band, that people become all protective because it becomes the one constant in their life. It becomes the one reliable thing. So they start throwing their all into it. They record gigs, they exchange albums, they start even getting involved in the band's personal lives. Even if the band don't actually know it, they find out how many children they have, what they do for their hobbies. It can be actually strangely intrusive to a certain level. And that's what this podcast was supposed to show, that there was this fictional fan who is being interviewed, presumably because he's well known as a source of information for the band within the country, and underneath his apparent love for the band is heartbreak and distraction, and you start to see why this band is so important to him and how actually it seems to be taken away from him. As I say, these people do throw their all into the bands, and then he throws himself into the community, trusts them because he thinks that they are there for the same justifiable reasons, at least in his mind, as he is. And then they apparently repay him by taking his wife away from him, and then he's left alone. And he doesn't have a wife, and everything else has fallen apart. All that he's got left in the world is the band. But what's that if the band, or at least the idea of the band, has betrayed him and he's got nothing? Does he continue to follow the band, even though that image is now broken in his mind? Or does he return back to the life that was damaged in the first place and have to face up to reality that maybe life isn't what you want it to be, and there is no perfect image? Episode 2 was Marjorie's Waiting, which is about a lady played by Kerry Headley Cheney, about a woman who's sitting in a hospital waiting room after her husband has had a heart attack, and she's deliberately delaying going into the room to see him because, as it turns out, he has been committing acts of domestic violence against her on a regular basis. In the podcast we hear that they originally met because she was brought in by his charm and his personality, and then as the time goes on it shows that actually it was a front, and that he's not a nice piece of work at all, and that she has struggled to have a life of her own purely because it has evolved around him, to the point where at the end he is at his bowling club, apparently one of his current hobbies at least. We don't actually hear how long he's been a member of the bowling club, although we hear that the character that Carrie is playing is quite familiar with the members of the club, so we can imagine that the hobby has been continuing for some time. And she hears that he's had a heart attack at the club and has been rushed to the hospital, and rather than being worried about it or saying anything of any love or concern, she's just focusing on the details, like, oh, who am I talking to? Doesn't show any love or emotion towards the person who's collapsed, because the way that the man has behaved over the years has actually broken away any element of love that there might have once been, and that she actually sees his heart attack as an escape. And that's why she's delaying going to see him, because she thinks that if she goes in and sees him, that might actually show care or love, something that he apparently hasn't shown her for a very long time. And if anything, she might even be waiting sadly for him to die in that room, because that means that she can go off and live the life that has apparently been denied to her all these years. It says a lot about commitment, it says a lot about duty, it says a lot about an older way of viewing things, and the way that people still do view their relationships. People think that marriage is forever, or people even think that relationships are forever. Once you make that commitment to love somebody, that's everything that it means. And people do get tied into situations like this, either through violent coercion or just through emotional commitment, which I find incredibly sad, because you only have one life, and a lot of these relationships are based on one person supporting another person while they live the life they want to live, which means that your life is dismissed as an accessory to their life, which is, I think, a complete waste. If you believe there is no afterlife, that there is only this life on earth, then that means that the only life you've been given has been spent entirely being given to someone else. If you are religious, then the same can be said to be true, that if there's a almighty creator, or even some sort of power in the universe who has decided that you have this life, isn't the ultimate respect to be that you should live the best life that you can? giving your life over to somebody else somehow contradicts this gift that you have been given. If you believe that your purpose is to live for others, then I can understand that, but why should that life be in pain and suffering when the person you're serving experience apparently no pain or suffering at all? So lots of that motivated this script. I do hope that if there is a character like Marjorie out there, that she, like Marjorie does, gains the strength to find the realisation that perhaps there's more to life and that maybe a line has to be drawn once you've been treated a certain way. Wesley's dog, which was episode 3, was played by Sam Rowland. Wesley's dog is about a guy that I imagined had some form of autism, or at least was on the spectrum, and he is waiting to hear about what's happening with his parents, while it turns out that the father has actually disappeared and left him there and abandoned him, and his mother has passed away and he's now on his own. And where he did have a dog, the only constant and love in his life, the father has taken that away from him years ago, unknown to Wesley. And it's difficult to tell in the story as to how much the character of Wesley is actually in denial. Does he secretly know that the dog is gone, and he just doesn't want to admit it because his world is based on regularity, constant, reliable people, something his parents have to an extent represented, and as that has collapsed around him, he's focused on the idea of his dog being there, and the dog represents something so much more. Once Upon a Time in St. Petersburg was actually based on a real event that I went through in 2003. This is actually played by Russian actor Alexandra Sokolova. I think gives across the feelings that I had about this experience. Essentially, I was dating a Russian girl many years ago, and from the minute I arrived in St. Petersburg to the moment I left, it was just very, very strange. This was 2003, so it's only 10 years or so since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And while we were there, just a series of very strange events happened. Even the aeroplane that I was on was essentially falling apart. I was sat by the fire exit of the plane, and water was leaking through the seal on the door through the entirety of the flight. The "put your seatbelts on" sign was lit up by traditional light bulbs, one of which was broken. When they gave me a tray to eat my dinner, they gave me a metal tray that plopped into slots in my chair. If there'd been any form of turbulence, this tray would have popped up in the air and decapitated me. This was very strange. When we landed at St. Petersburg Airport, I saw there were stones all over the runway. There were abandoned Soviet helicopters strewn across the side of the neglected airport. When I got into the airport itself to be met by my then girlfriend, she told me that there was, I asked her, are we getting a taxi or anything like this? And no, we were going to just flag a car down, which was, she claimed, very normal. And yeah, I understood that the way that people travel around was that it was just people in their normal cars, and they made money by just driving around until people flagged them down. And if they were going a certain way, then they would agree to drive them. This was a Lada. It was a early 80s Lada. It had a massive crack in its windscreen. It was barely roadworthy. As we got driving towards my then girlfriend's apartment, the first car that I saw was a tractor, which didn't help my stereotypical views at that time of the country. The road itself was really in dire need of repair. And yeah, everything that is said in the podcast is true, is something that happened. You could tell whether a policeman was corrupt by the quality of the car outside his building. The hospital we visited after my girlfriend was attacked by this dog was dilapidated, had bloody cotton swabs and needles outside. The building was cracking. There was plaster peeling away. As we went in, we were greeted by a waiting room which was like something out of a film. There was a Russian soldier sat there. There was a lady sat down with bloody bandages over her foot, who spent the entirety of our 3-hour waiting time complaining about how she should be seen first because she had been in the siege of Leningrad, and that she had fought off the Nazis and now deserved to be seen by a doctor ahead of anybody else because she claimed herself to be a hero of the Soviet Union, albeit unofficially. We then went off to report to the police about this dog that had attacked her, and the police cell was exactly as described in the podcast. It was a complete culture shock to me. The very fact that she'd been attacked by a half dog, half wolf in the first place was enough to make me realise that perhaps I wasn't in Kansas anymore, as you might quote it. It was altogether a very weird experience. What I didn't say in the podcast was that at the time that I arrived in St. Petersburg, it was the 300th anniversary of the city. And as we got the metro into the city, there was an armed guard at every single station, stopping anyone that looked like they should have been of conscription age, stopping them and asking them why they weren't in the army at that time, trying to spot deserters and shirkers. It was well known at that time that they were expecting a number of foreign dignitaries into the city from other countries. So police were going around stopping cars from going into the city for any reason. Your light is out, your window is broken, your car doesn't meet standards. They wanted there to be zero traffic jams for when prime ministers and presidents internationally arrived. They were under orders to clear the city of traffic so that it could be as empty as possible and look like a modern free-flowing city. It was very weird to me. While I was there, we were going to go to the opera, and we soon found out that because I was not from Russia, that every single tourist spot that I went to charged me double for anything that I went to. Like, oh, you're not from Russia, yeah, you pay double. And that was just the way that it was. So once we started realising this was happening, we realised that we were going to have to pay double for the opera as well. So as we went in, we pretended that we were in a rush. And my girlfriend and I ran straight through past the ticket officers as my girlfriend's mother went up to the ticket booth and said, "Hi, sorry, are we late?" And they said, no, you still have 10 minutes left. Well, she said, that's really good. They said, for a moment, I thought that you were rushing past us because you were foreign and you didn't want to pay the fee. And she laughed it off. The very next day, we went off to go on a tour of the canals through Russia on a boat. And I had to pay double that everybody else did. However, the commentary on the boat was only in Russian, so I had to pay twice as much for something I could only understand in half. But that was how it was, and from what I've heard, nothing much has changed. It's a place that, although like any major city would love to have more and more tourists, for some reason charges tourists like a source of income to be exploited, which I find unfortunate, because it's not going to encourage people to go back there twice. And I find that very sad, because St. Petersburg was an amazing city and a very beautiful city with a lot to see for anyone. The last episode on this list today was Dave the Almighty with Peter Fiorini, who I actually had the pleasure of knowing from his days at Rose Bruford, the same college that I studied as an actor in southeast London here in the UK. Dave the Almighty is about a guy that is supposed to be going to church and is convinced not to go to church because actually his friend is God, or at least the all-knowing creator. And it's about how, it's about two things really. One is about how friends will do anything to make sure their friends are there, especially if they're, for example, alcoholics. They will say anything to make sure that their friends stay in the pub with them and enable their habit to continue. But it's also about trust. It seemed a strange irony to me that, for example, in the case of religion, it seemed a strange irony that when it comes to your friends, if they claim anything, that you will generally question them on it. You will say, well, hang on a minute, just like the character does in this podcast. Once Dave starts claiming that he's God, Peter's character says to him, well, hang on a minute, like, how can you be God if this, that and the other? And Dave is able to come up with apparent excuses as to why he is the almighty creator. But this is actually a contradiction, because when people go to church, they don't tend to say, hang on a mo, what are you talking about? People just buy it. And they seem to forget the fact that the priest is actually paid. The priest is paid to be there he does have an agenda. If you don't turn up to church, he doesn't have a parish anymore, and in theory he can lose his job and perhaps his house. So it's in his interest, financially speaking, for you to keep believing what he says. Now, that's not to say that what he's saying isn't true, but it does highlight the fact that this man is somebody with a financial agenda behind his whole mission, which I find disturbing, to be honest, because that makes him no more than a salesman than anyone else who's trying to convince you of a particular message. For example, why you should buy a timeshare in Spain for 2 weeks, why you should invest in this stock and share or that. His motivations are not 100% because born out of something that's 100% honest or true. There is always that unfortunate incentive there, and for me that just takes away a lot of validity of what they're claiming. And lastly, the very fact that people don't question him does disturb me anyway, because as Hitchens said, and I'm going to hideously misquote him, I'm sure, why should you be providing evidence for something that someone else is claiming to you without evidence? I find it quite interesting that if you said to somebody, I don't believe in God, the first question they say is, why? And of course, it's not up to you to prove it, because you're not the one who's claiming there is a God. That they should say, no, there is a God because of reasons A, B, and C. And generally, people aren't able to do that. When you say to people, why do you believe in a God? They'll actually come up with a number of things which can be disproved, but ultimately they'll just say, because I have faith. Something which you don't apply to any other area of your life. If someone says that they've carried out work for you, if you're, for example, a manager, you will ask to see the work. You won't just say, oh, okay, fair enough, and then just walk away. It seems a strange contradiction in your life. And I think that I just want, from my own point of view, I just want people to be a little bit more analytical, because then maybe we would view politicians differently, and we would view anybody with an apparent agenda differently, and maybe then we wouldn't be so regularly disappointed in our lives either, as we unfortunately so regularly are by people in the public eye when we find out that they are not all that they seem. Thank you for listening to this. Just my attempt to cast a little bit of light on the episodes I've broadcast. So that was episodes 1 to 5. I do hope that I'll be in a position to bring you more original drama. We are in the middle of dark season at the moment. I do hope that you're enjoying those episodes through The Dead Famous. And if you haven't listened to The Dead Famous so far, please do. It's episodes 1 to 7 of an original work, as all of the works on this podcast are, all written by me, just for This Is Sofaville. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them on, for example, our YouTube channel at This Is Sofaville. And don't forget to subscribe. We're on Spotify, we're on all manner of channels, which I understand you found because you're listening to this one here. I do thank you for listening. We have listeners in the United States, the United Kingdom, Finland, Germany, Russia, Netherlands, Iran, Argentina. I know that you're all out there. I see you. I'm extremely honoured, as are all the participants in the podcast. We know you're there. We know you're listening, and it just warms the heart. It really does. Oh, other countries, Sweden, Greece, we know you're there. We love you all, and we appreciate it, and we look forward to you listening in next week as well. This would also seem to be a very appropriate time to say thank you so much to Shane Ivers of Silverman Sound. It's his music that you're continually hearing on all of the This Is Sofaville podcasts. Without him, it would not be possible. Go and have a look at his website, www.silvermansound.com, and have a listen to some of the fantastic music he's creating. He's a one-man machine, he really is. This is Sofaville signing off. Bye-bye.